Hi everyone, I hope everyone's doing well. So we're going to cover chapter 5 on biological aspects of personality. So up until this point, we've been talking about how environmental factors can affect our behavior and our personality. But we also know that biological factors, starting with a person's genes, can also affect people's traits and characteristic responses. And so a person is not born a blank slate that is written on by the environment, but there are also inherent predispositions and abilities. And so looking at these direct biological effects and genetic effects started with Charles Darwin, and he came up with the theory of evolution. And so he argued that people evolve directly from primitive species. And this idea was so radical that Darwin spent much effort arguing points about the similarity of human bones, nerves, and muscles to those of other primates. Charles Darwin also pointed out natural selection. And so he argued that people's differentiating characteristics are what helps individuals survive. And so that means these individual characteristics help people reproduce and pass on their genes to their offspring. So, for example, in a dangerous environment that's full of predators, those individuals who are large or tough are able to organize defenses that are most likely to survive. Another example is individuals that are fast or smart may be able to build up defenses in which they can survive or come up with tactics that make it more likely for them to survive. So in this analysis, attention is drawn to the function of a characteristic. And some examples of functionalism are speed, intelligence, and sociability. So evolutionary personality theory is drawing attention to individual differences. So individual differences and motivations are seen as due to either alternative adaptive strategies or to random variation, but it's difficult to determine the precise causes. But it is clear that many of our individual characteristics and tendencies are more accurately in our genes. There are some examples that demonstrate that genetic factors can dramatically influence personality. So one example is Angelman syndrome. This is a biological disorder that's caused by a defect on chromosome 15. So human cells have 23 pairs of chromosomes, with half of each pair contributed by each parent. And the chromosome contains the genes that control your body's manufacture of proteins. And your genes develop in many ways. And so they can affect development, such as the structural development of how your brain and bodies grow. They can also affect your physiological development, such as your hormones and your general metabolic function. So in Angelman syndrome, there's children that have this disorder that usually are attractive and friendly, but they also suffer mental retardation, sleep very little, and they walk with a jerky movement. So given the fact that there are several biological genetic disorders, genes can dramatically influence personality in unusual cases. And so there's questions that still remain about the extent to which genes are affecting our personality in normal development and which aspects they are shaping. The human genome is the complete set of genes that are located on the 23 pairs of chromosomes that define the biological human being. And so there's the mapping of genes done in the year of 2000. So the human genome was unraveled around that time in the sense that genes were marked on the DNA strands. And the functions and roles of each gene are really far from understood. They're not understood, but the map holds the potential to understand personality a little bit better by discovering biological instructions that our genes are producing. And so the study of how these genes are affecting our behavior is called behavioral genomics. Pavlov was a Russian physiologist that discovered classical conditioning in the salivation responses of dogs. And he was interested in the differences in individuals' nervous systems. His investigations focused on an animal's orientation responses to new stimuli. And he knew that the organism must respond appropriately for the organism to orient adaptively to the environment. So the organism must have the correct sensitivity to detect food or danger, but an overreaction to stimuli would leave the organism feeling stressed or unable to discriminate appropriately. So we need to respond when danger is near, but not to respond as if everything is a danger. At birth, there are certain temperamental and sensitivity differences that are detected among infants. And the term temperament is used to refer to stable individual differences in emotional reactivity. So, for example, temperament would be described as why some babies are very affectionate or they're very quiet. They may sleep much of the day. They may have certain social anxiety or attachment anxiety if they're not cuddled. So there's others are exceptionally active. Some may respond poorly, or they may be avoidant of their parents. And so this is kind of what explains temperament. So it's these stable individual differences, typically that result after birth. One major characteristic of temperament is that reactivity remains stable over time as children mature. So, for example, a lot of longitudinal studies that have measured people's physiological reactivity to stimuli have found that these differences remain relatively consistent over time as people get older. And so it remains stable and doesn't really change. So although there are differing accounts and models of temperament, many agree that there are four basic aspects. So these four basic aspects are activity, emotionality, sociability, and aggressiveness and impulsiveness. So some children are almost always in vigorous motion, while others may be more passive. So there is this activity dimension. Then there's some children that are easily aroused to anger or fear, whereas other children are calmer, so they don't exhibit as much emotionality as others. There's another dimension of sociability. So for example, children that are more sociable tend to approach others and enjoy others' company, whereas other children may not be as sociable and like to keep to themselves. And then the aggressive, impulsive dimension characterizes the extent to which children are aggressive and impulsive rather than conscientious and friendly. Scientists measure children's temperament dimensions based on observing, counting, and coding. Eysenck proposed a model of nervous system temperament, which says that we need methods to explain basic temperaments by tracking the nervous system and looking at hormonal changes that are accompanying this stable reactivity pattern. And so looking at several patterns of physiological responsiveness, we're able to look at the patterns of people's emotional reactivity. There's some interesting research on the effects of biological temperament on personality. So particularly in the area of introversion and extroversion, introverts are generally quiet, reserved, and thoughtful, whereas extroverts are active and sociable. Although these notions of introversion and extroversion appear in many personality theories, Eysenck ties the dimension directly to the central nervous system. And so the basic idea is that extroverts are sociable and want to be with others because they have a relatively low level of brain arousal. And so they seek this stimulation and energy outside. So they get it from external factors, whereas introverts are thought to have a higher level of central nervous system arousal, and so they tend to shy away from stimulating social environments because they already have a level of this central nervous system arousal that they don't need more. There are many problems in trying to test a nervous system-based theory of temperament. First, it's difficult to define and measure what nervous system arousal is. There's really no way to measure it, like a thermometer or a single response, like a fever. And then the other problem is that the human body is a system that attempts to maintain homeostasis. And so responses can rise and fall, and they can vary in baseline, intensity, and duration. Gray's reinforcement sensitivity theory also includes Pavlov's classical notion that animals' nervous systems have evolved to favor the environment. So we have evolved to being able to detect attractions versus dangers. But his theory also emphasizes the notion of the importance of reward and punishment for appropriate and inappropriate behaviors. So not only is our nervous system a part of this whole process, but we are also having to learn through the environment. And so the environment is constantly shaping us, and we are constantly learning from experience. And so it's really the combination between how our nervous systems are evolving, but also how we are learning and gaining experience in the environment. That is the key to survival. There's relevant biological systems, which are the behavioral inhibition system and the behavioral approach system. The behavioral inhibition system is providing the orienting response to a novel situation and is also responding to things that are punishing. And so in order for us to gain experience, we have to first respond to a new situation. We have to learn from a new situation. We have to experience the situation. If our system is sensitive to this situation, then we are more prone to anxiety, and we are always alert and worrying that something bad is going to happen to us. The behavioral activation system regulates our response to rewards. And so it's how we learn to enjoy rewarding activities. If our nervous system is overly active, then we are impulsive and we are constantly seeking out these rewards. A related nervous system approach to personality focuses on sensation seeking. So sensation seekers have this consistent tendency to seek out highly stimulating activities. So this is not really has anything to do with being simply extroverted or introverted, because sensation seekers don't have a consistent preference as to whether they enjoy being around other people. This is more about seeking highly stimulating activities, regardless of whether they are with others. So think about people that are always on the lookout for a new challenge or a new high, such as going skydiving, or they may be attracted to the unknown. There are some theories about this. This theory similarly proposes that sensation seekers have a low level of natural internal biological activation, and so they seek arousal from the environment to make up for that. So consistent with Pavlov's original notions, sensation seekers seem to have this strong nervous system-based orienting response, and they seem biologically primed to seek out and engage their environments. One way we can understand people's natural inclinations is by understanding how the brain and the nerves work. So neurotransmitters are chemicals that nerves use to communicate in the brain. And one core component is the neurotransmitter dopamine. And there's some evidence showing genetic differences in dopamine availability and regulation. And so studies have found that children with impaired dopamine relevant genes tend to do worse in abusive environments compared to those who don't have this genetic risk. So it's especially a problem when the environment is unpredictable and it seems to be uncontrollable. One example is drug abuse. So take an example of cocaine addiction. So the question is, why may people that seek sensations be drawn to cocaine and more likely to become addicted? Cocaine prevents the reabsorption of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And so when dopamine concentrations rise in the bloodstream, you get this emotional high. And it's initially created, but then the brain is severely disrupted as the dopamine levels later crash. And so it's likely that people who have these inclinations or defects or certain types of individual differences in their systems tend to be predisposed to environments that bring out these defects. So people that may have disease-caused weakness in their dopamine systems may be especially susceptible to cocaine addiction. And so people may have natural tendencies or natural processes going on which are making them more susceptible to certain environments, such as abusive environments. Twin research is one of the most popular ways of studying biological effects on personality, and twin research detects systematic biological influences. A lot of twin research compares identical twins to fraternal twins. So identical twins share the same genetic makeup, and fraternal twins have a comparable genetic overlap to ordinary brothers and sisters. So they're sharing 50% of the DNA, whereas identical twins are sharing 100%. And studies have found that identical twins are more similar than fraternal twins on several key dimensions: emotional stability, conscientiousness, intelligence, and extroversion. Now, you can argue that, oh, this is a biological basis for personality, but it may not be the case because identical twins may also be treated more similarly by their parents compared to fraternal twins. And so they may look more alike and their parents may dress them alike, or they are sharing these qualities because they are in the same environment. And so they are consciously trying to act more similarly compared to fraternal twins. And so for these reasons, it's more informative to compare twins that have been raised apart from each other and they're in separate environments to really see whether or not they still have these similar characteristics. Sir Francis Galton studied genetic influences on personality, and he was inspired by the work of Charles Darwin, and he drew family trees of blood relatives of famous and eminent people. And he found that eminence seemed to run in families. So, for example, a son might succeed his father as a professor at a university. He also noticed that among the lower classes, hardly anyone achieved eminence. And so he believed in the eugenics movement, but one flaw was he was not taking into account the fact that biological theories of personality may be tied to social and political outcomes. So in the case of women, women could not graduate from top colleges like Yale or Princeton until the 1970s. There were a lack of access and resources for women. The same lack of access and resources also applied to the lower classes. And so these were some of the flaws in his beliefs, that there's a lot of psychosocial factors that are contributing to differences in eminence and behavior and personality in general. The famous Minnesota twin study evaluated the identical twins of Jack and Oscar, who were separated in infancy, but they were brought together as adults. And so they were raised apart, but then they were gathered in a study at the University of Minnesota. And they found that these twin brothers, despite them living apart, they shared many traits and habits. And so these twins were both absent-minded, and they both liked certain things, like spicy food, and they had this angry sort of temperament. And so it's interesting because other studies have found similar evidence where there's similarities in personality between people that have the same genetic makeup, but they were raised in different environments. And so these implications reveal that there are similarities, and they're likely due to genetic endowments. There's a genetic control of personality. And these patterns of genes are affecting people's temperaments and their behavioral predispositions. A controversial book called The Nurture Assumption was written by Judith Rich Harris, who argued that parents matter little, but peers sometimes matter a lot. And she also argued that identical twins that are raised apart have similar personalities. Different children raised by the same parents have different personalities. And adopted children that are raised by the same parents have different personalities. By pointing out this importance of peers mattering a lot, this is illustrating the concept of non-shared environmental variance. And this includes features of the environment that children raised in the same home are experiencing differently. So for example, the first child in a family experiences the second child as a sibling, whereas the second child has the first child as a sibling. And so the family environments are including different members. And so the same features are experienced differently by different children. So the non-shared variance claims that when we get older, we start to choose certain environments. But in the meantime, while we're choosing these environments, we're also being exposed to more varied situations and having different experiences. And so some aspects of the genetic predispositions are becoming more important, while others become less important. And so behavior and personality is really a result of the interaction of genes and the environment. The environments that we're choosing, but also the genetic predispositions that are becoming more important depending on the situations that we're in and what we're experiencing. And so an overview of epigenetics is that personality and behavior is based on the expression of genes, and that these genes can be turned on or off. The environment can change the expression of genes. So the expression of genes which is the activation or inactivation of relevant parts of the genome, is what's known as epigenetics. And the aspects of that are affecting personality are biology, socialization, and the environment. So for example, in times of food deprivation or high stress and trauma, the way our body makes proteins can change over time, which produces long-term differences in us, even though we have a particular genotype, a DNA sequence. So genes can be turned on or off. And so that's one reason why identical twins can show different rates of depression or mental illness that are known to have a genetic basis.